You're 32 years old, and you're staring at numbers you avoided at 24. It's not casual math. It's the kind you do late at night with your phone glowing in a dark room and a quiet pressure building in your chest like something overdue. You're calculating what your 20s actually cost you, not just in money, but in time, in missed years of compounding that never had the chance to begin. The investments you didn't make because you thought you had time. The assets you didn't build because it never felt urgent. The retirement contributions you could have made every year that would have quietly grown while you live your life. You know the scenario. You've seen the comparisons. Someone who started early with small amounts ends up ahead of someone who starts later with more effort. You've read it enough times that it doesn't surprise you anymore. It just sits there, heavy and undeniable. Understanding it doesn't reverse it. It only makes it clearer. And now you have to live with that clarity. This is your starting point. Not from nothing, but from awareness of what didn't happen. You start with a number that represents delay, and that number feels real. What your 20s actually took from you. Not dramatically, quietly, gradually, in ways that didn't feel like loss at the time. You earned money. Not much at first, then more, then just enough to feel stable. And you spent it, not recklessly. That's what makes it harder to process now. There is no single decision you can point to and say that's where everything went wrong. It didn't disappear in one place. It dissolved across hundreds of normal decisions that felt reasonable in the moment. It went into rent that stretched just slightly beyond what you should have paid because the place felt better. Into food that didn't feel excessive because everyone around you was doing the same. Into convenience that saved time in the moment and cost you silently over years. Into upgrades that felt earned. Into things that improved your present but never touched your future. That's where it went. Small amounts consistently over nearly a decade. You didn't think in terms of compounding. You thought in terms of affordability. If you could afford it, you bought it. If the payment fit, it made sense. That was the framework. And it worked for living, but it didn't work for building. Because building requires something different. It requires you to think in decades while living in days. And in your 20s, decades don't feel real enough to compete with now. So you arrive here, early 30s, with income history behind you and very little to show for it in invested assets. Maybe a small retirement account that exists because a company enrolled you automatically. Maybe some savings that moves in and out like a buffer instead of a base. Maybe debt that accumulated gradually and never felt urgent enough to eliminate completely. And there's a specific kind of awareness that comes with this moment. It's not panic. It's not even regret in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter, a realization that nothing external caused this. No collapse, no crisis, just years of decisions that made sense individually and didn't work collectively. Here is what matters now. This position is not permanent. It is not fixed. It is not ideal, but it is workable. The system that builds wealth still exists. It has not closed. It has not become unavailable because you arrived late. It simply requires more from you now than it would have before. More consistency, more intention, more sacrifice in places you previously didn't question. The math did not disappear. It adjusted. That's the part most people resist. They want the same outcome with the same effort they would have needed at 22. That version is gone. This version is different. It asks more, but it still works. And the difference between people who rebuild and people who stay here is not intelligence. It's not access. It's whether they accept that the starting point has changed and act accordingly. The machine is still here. It still runs. It still compounds. But it only works for the people who actually step into it and stay there long enough for it to matter. Something changes in your 30s that didn't exist before. Not externally, internally. The same information you ignored at 25 starts to feel heavier at 32. Not because it's new, but because it finally connects to something real. Time becomes visible in a way it wasn't before. At 24, retirement is a concept. At 32, it's a timeline. Not immediate, but no longer abstract. You can measure it. You can feel the distance shrinking. And with that comes something unfamiliar. Consequences start to feel attached to your decisions in a way they didn't before. You've seen enough now. Enough examples. Enough outcomes. You've watched people struggle later than you expected. You've seen stability disappear faster than you thought it could. You've experienced moments where money wasn't optional, where it wasn't about preference, but necessity. And that changes how you think. You start asking different questions. Not what do I want right now, but what does this cost me later? Not can I afford this, but what am I trading for it? That shift is subtle, but it's foundational. It moves you from reacting to your life to designing it, even if the design is still rough. And along with that shift comes something else. Pressure, not overwhelming, but persistent. The sense that time matters now in a way it didn't before. That doing nothing is no longer neutral. It's a decision with consequences that you can now imagine clearly enough to take seriously. Most people try to get rid of that feeling. They distract from it. They soften it. They tell themselves they still have time. And they do. But they use that truth to avoid the urgency instead of CH. They let it inform their behavior. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but consistently. It becomes a filter, a quiet standard in the background of every decision. Not perfect, not always followed, but present enough to shift the overall direction. This is where building actually begins. Not with a number, not with a strategy, with a change in how you evaluate your choices. Because without that shift, any plan you create will collapse under the same patterns that created the problem. You don't need more information. You had that already. You need alignment between what you know and what you do. And that alignment is uncomfortable at first. It requires saying no to things that previously felt normal. It requires delaying things that feel deserved. It requires operating differently than the people around you who are still in the same patterns you were in. That's the cost of change at this stage. Not complexity, not difficulty in understanding. Consistency in execution. Day after day, decision after decision. Quietly, without immediate reward. But that is also the advantage. Because once that shift locks in, the system becomes easier to maintain. You stop debating every choice. You start defaulting to a direction. And that direction compounds in ways that are not immediately visible, but become undeniable over time. You're in your early 30s. You decide to look at everything clearly. Not roughly, not approximately. Exactly. Every account, every balance, every recurring expense. You sit down and write it all out. And the number you see is not shocking. It's confirming. It matches what you already felt. That clarity is where building starts. Not motivation, not inspiration. Clarity. Because without it, every decision is based on assumption. And assumptions are usually wrong in directions that delay progress. You make a few changes, not extreme ones, targeted ones. You reduce the expenses that don't meaningfully improve your life. Not everything, just the ones that exist. That's the key shift. Automation. You remove the need to decide every month. The system moves before you have the chance to interfere with it. A fixed amount leaves your account and goes somewhere it can grow. It feels small at first, almost insignificant, but the size is not the point. The consistency is. At the same time, you deal with what is working against you. Debt. Not all debt is equal, but the kind that carries high interest and no long-term value has to go. You don't eliminate it instantly. You reduce it steadily. Every month, without interruption. The first year is not impressive. Nothing about it looks like success from the outside. Your net worth doesn't explode. Your lifestyle doesn't improve. If anything, it feels tighter, more controlled, less flexible. That's what building a foundation feels like. But something changes beneath that surface. Stability. Not complete, but growing. You become less vulnerable to small disruptions. Expenses that would have created stress before now become manageable. That shift is subtle, but it's critical. Because instability is what destroys progress. As time passes, the system starts to show movement. Debt decreases. Savings increase. Investments begin to accumulate. Slowly, then slightly less slowly. You adjust your contributions upward when your income allows it. Not dramatically, gradually. Enough to create upward pressure without breaking consistency. And then something happens that didn't exist before. Momentum. Not visible every day, but present across months. You look back and see change. Not theoretical. Actual. Numbers that are higher than they were. Obligations that are lower than they were. That's the first proof that what you're doing works. From there, the focus shifts. You don't just maintain the system. You feed it. You look for ways to increase the amount flowing into it. Through your primary income. Through better decisions. Through opportunities you would have ignored before because they required effort you weren't willing to give. You don't need perfection. You need continuation. That's what most people miss. They think the system fails when they slip. It doesn't. It fails when they stop. As long as it continues, even imperfectly, it moves forward. And forward at this stage is enough. A few years pass. Not dramatically. Quietly. The system keeps running. You keep feeding it. You adjust where necessary. You correct mistakes when they happen. You don't abandon the structure because of them. And the numbers begin to reflect that consistency. Not in a way that feels extreme, but in a way that feels solid, real. You can measure progress now without needing optimism to interpret it. It exists on its own. You're no longer starting. That phase is over. You are building, and building feels different. Less emotional, more procedural. You know what to do. You know what matters. You know what doesn't. At this stage, a new challenge appears. Comparison. You notice where others are. People who started earlier. People who made different choices. And the gap between you and them is visible. It's measurable. And if you focus on it too much, it becomes discouraging. But the gap is not your metric. It never was. Your metric is distance from where you began. And in that direction, you have moved significantly. That is what matters. Because that is what you control. You also begin to understand something that isn't obvious at the beginning. Starting later changes how you operate. You are less reactive, less impulsive, more deliberate. Not because you are naturally that way, but because you've experienced the cost of not being that way. That experience becomes an advantage. You make fewer large mistakes. You avoid decisions that look good short-term and fail long-term. You recognize patterns faster. You correct faster. Over time, that matters more than people expect. Your income likely increases as well. Not automatically, but as a result of decisions you make differently now. You negotiate. You move. You pursue opportunities with a clearer understanding of their long-term value. And when that income increases, you don't treat it the way you did before. You don't absorb all of it into your lifestyle. You direct a portion of it into the system you've built. That's where acceleration happens. Not from risk, from increased input. And over enough time, that input compounds. Not dramatically at first, then more noticeably, until eventually the system reaches a point where it supports itself in part. Where growth is not only coming from what you add, but from what already exists. That is the shift you are working toward. Not freedom immediately. Stability first, then growth, then optionality. And when you look forward now, the future is different. Not guaranteed, not perfect, but structured, directed, moving. You didn't start early. That part is true. But you started. And over time, that distinction matters more than the timing ever did. And the understanding is the one thing you can carry forward even if you couldn't go back and change the start. The truth about beginning in your 30s is simple, but it isn't easy to accept. You will not arrive at the same place as someone who began at 22. That gap is real. It doesn't disappear with effort or optimism, and pretending otherwise only delays what you need to do next. But that is not the full picture, because what you build now is still yours. Built deliberately, built with awareness, built with a level of discipline that only comes from seeing what happens when you delay it. The person who starts now understands something differently. This process is not luck. It is not timing. It is repetition. It is showing up when it is inconvenient and continuing when it is slow. Starting later doesn't remove that opportunity. It only makes the decision clearer. There is a version of your life where this realization passes and nothing changes, where you acknowledge it, feel it, and return to the same patterns. That version is common. It is easy to fall into because it asks nothing new from you. But it is not the only version. There's another version where you act. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just consistently. You begin from where you are with what you have, and you let that be enough to start. Because it is enough to start. Time is still moving. It will keep moving whether you participate or not. The difference is whether it moves with something building alongside it. You have waited long enough.